I have a few things to say about the power plant and tonight's event. But before I do that, let me first say a big thank you to Chubb Insurance, our international arts partner, for their support for this event for a second year, and also for their long-term commitment to the arts generally. So thank you, Chubb Insurance. I thought the best way to talk about the power plant was to tell you a bit about myself. And I should start by saying I'm a tax lawyer by trade. I litigate and resolve tax disputes. Now, don't panic, don't panic. I don't work for the CRA. I work for taxpayers against the CRA. So a lot of my work is done in writing or over the phone. But sometimes I need a meeting. I need to meet a client, good or difficult one, or an adversary, and that meeting has to be face-to-face. The reason to meet face-to-face are obvious. I need to see with my own eyes and hear with my own ears what's going on. Assess the body language. Size up the client or the opponent. Test their reactions. At the power plant, we also do our business face-to-face. We connect the viewers to the works as closely as possible to engage them with the works. We want to create an experience while promoting the power plant's values of diversity, excellence, and inclusion. And we're all able to do that all year, all free. Thanks to BMO for their continued support in that regard. By the way, if you have not had a chance to visit the gallery recently, go see our exhibitions. We have solo exhibitions by Nufus Ramirez Figueroa, David Petros, Rashid Johnson, and Naim Mohammed. And in this regard, I would also like to thank the presenting sponsor of those 4 incredible exhibitions, TD, The Ready Commitment. Thank you, TD. As in the past, face-to-face, the event brings contemporary art buffs, or if you're like me, art junkies, to come together with renowned artists for an intimate conversation. We can hear from artists of different generations, experiences, practices, and countries. But face-to-face, the event is not only about this great venue, the excellent food, and the beautiful people in this room. Face-to-face brings the power plant's community together. Face-to-face is also an enabler, a real catalyst. It allows to extend the conversation beyond those walls and those of the gallery. By being here tonight, you all support, you all champion the power plant and its outreach programs like the Expanding Access and Power Youth. Your contribution this evening helps more and more communities to come face-to-face with contemporary art. So on my behalf and on behalf of my fellow board members and the formidable team of the power plant, a big thank you to you all for being here tonight to support our institutions and its best-in-class programming. So enjoy the evening, and speaking of formidable, Gaëtan Vernat.
Merci, Jacques. So once again, thank you all for joining us this evening, and thanks again to our generous partner, Chubb Insurance. As Jacques mentioned, Face-to-Face is a celebration of community and coming together to share enthusiasm and ideas. On that note, we are so grateful to have such a talented group of multi-generational local and international artists with us tonight. we're thrilled to present a panel of artists and art industry leaders, including two of our upcoming Winter 2021 exhibiting artists, Sasha Huber, who's a visual artist of Swiss Haitian heritage, whose work is primarily concerned with the politics of memory and belonging, particularly in relation to colonial residue left in the environment. And then we'll also have Danish-Scottish artist Shona Illingworth, whose work across range of media, including sound, film, video, photography, and drawing, and she's known for her immersive video and multi-channel sound installations and evocative research-led process. Joining these two incredible artists, we have our renowned curator and art consultant, Jessica Bradley, whose wide experience has afforded her insight into global issues and gaps in gender representation and the theme of collecting the non-material. I would like to also welcome back Kate Taylor, Globe and Mail visual art critic and the moderator of tonight's panel. So welcome, Kate, and over to you. Thank you.
I wanted to start with our artists, and we're being treated to some incredibly surprising images up here, startling and interesting images. So I thought we could start with having the artists explain to us a little bit about their current work before we move on to a sort of more general discussion. So Sasha, do you want to take it away and tell us what you've been working on?
Yeah, so I've been working on extending a project that will be presented here as well, which I started 2008 already, so over a decade long. It's a work that is mostly about actually dismantling a history of Louis Agassiz, who was a Swiss glaciologist, foremost known as that, but after immigrating from Switzerland to the States in 1846, he developed in becoming one of the most influential racists of the 19th century, and that history was kind of left aside.
So he's known as a glaciologist, but then he sort of has this other darker side, which is a sort of so-called scientific racist. And we have several, apparently, I found there's a town in BC named for him.
No, this is not, actually, it's called Agassiz, but it's not after him, another Agassiz. But there are anyways about 15 places named after Agassiz in Canada alone, but around the world there are around 80 places. And then they are on the moon and Mars, and 7 species hold Louis Agassiz's name.
And you're part of a project to rename these, I gather.
Yeah, so it started in 2007 when a campaign was launched called Demounting Louis Agassiz, which was about renaming a particular mountain in Switzerland named after him to be renamed after Renty. And Renty was one of the 6 enslaved persons he photographed on a South Carolina plantation in the States. And based on those photographs, that was in 1850, he tried to prove the inferiority of the black race. And this series is known as the slave daguerreotype series, which is housed...
It's a form of eugenics, in effect.
Yes, yeah. Yes. This was photography, technology of photography was just invented at the time, so they were daguerreotypes. And it was the first time where photographs were made of enslaved people. And people were stripped naked from all sides. And this is, for me, the first time to know about this history, and I got really captured, and I felt I have to do something. So on one of the pictures you see me flying to the place, because I'm not a mountaineer, and that's the only way of getting there was through the air. So I renamed the mountain physically, and this was the beginning of this ongoing project that I will extend here in Canada as well, and I already did a few years ago.
And can you give us a little bit of a sneak peek of what you might be doing at the power plant next year?
Yeah, so this is still in the planning and raising funds to do it. It's going to be taking place in Nunavut on Ellesmere Island. There is Agassiz ice cap, which is 21,000 square kilometers big. It's a glacier still. So planning a work over there is the challenge this year.
Good. Sounds intriguing. So, Shona, do you want to talk a little bit about your recent work?
Yeah, so one of the works I'll be showing at the power plant is a work called Lesions in the Landscape, which is not on here just at the moment, but and I've worked for a very long time in an interdisciplinary way, so I do projects that have very kind of long research. And Lesions in the Landscape looks at the impact of amnesia or forgetting on an individual and on a society. But I'm particularly interested in the role that memory has in our capacity to imagine the future. And in particular, what happens if memory is somehow restrained, or the role that amnesic processes play in restricting memory, and then the impact that that has on the kinds of futures that we can imagine. So St Kilda is an island off the west coast of Scotland where I grew up. It's very much part of the cultural imagining of that place. It was inhabited for 4,000 years, from the Stone Age till 1930, when it was evacuated. And those islands during the 19th century were very much constructed in a kind of as part of an oceanic sublime. So very wealthy tourists would come and travel to this place to look at the people of St Kilda, who were very much cast as living outside of modernity, living outside of time, of being somehow primitive peoples. They were very much denigrated in the narratives that were constructed about St Kilda, and of over 700 books written about the islands, there are no books, no historical accounts written by people who lived there. But I was very interested in the fact that this narrative about these islands perpetuate, and there's the romanticization of this place continues, and there is a fixation on the moment of the evacuation, of the end of this living memory.
In 1930.
In 1930, yeah. But what that inadvertently conceals, in a way, is the fact that this island group are the location of radar, which is part of a major weapons testing range for very high-end missiles, drones, other kinds of high-end weapons. And so this piece, in a way, explores how we understand and construct landscape and our relationship to landscape, but landscape not just as a kind of physical domain, but landscape as a kind of social, geopolitical, culturally constructed space, and the role that memory has, and in this case amnesia has, in that.
And is it that body of work that you'll be continuing at the power plant, or is that next year?
No,
you can't
so
say.
I can give you, I'll say something about the work. Yeah. So I'm developing what for me is a really major project. It is a project that draws on many years of exploring and working and developing a practice. And it, so one of the things in St Kilda when I was working in that space was the upper limit of that landscape, and that work is the International Space Station. And that work introduces the idea that this landscape that's constructed as remote and disconnected from the world is actually very much part of a kind of global geopolitical space, of which the technology in outer space is very important, not just in terms of the military testing, but also in terms of how that landscape was mapped archaeologically. And so out of the process of thinking about things, these questions I developed, or have been developing since about 2012, but really building the project since in the last 3-4 years, a project called Topologies of Air. And Topologies of Air considers how the sky, the space above our heads, is in a kind of Western modernist tradition, is a secular space. It's conceived as open and empty and limitless. And that in some way obscures the fact that the airspace above our heads is changing at an absolutely phenomenal rate. In the last 100 years, humans have transformed that space chemically, militarily, psychologically, and technology is causing that change to accelerate. And what's happening is you're having a growing disparity of power between those that control that space and people on the ground. And so Topologies of Air brings together many different perspectives, expertise, experience, different cosmologies, the ways in which different cultures have very long and deep histories of engagement and understanding of our relationship to the sky, together in a series of an international forum, which is it's called the Airspace Tribunal. And the Airspace Tribunal, I'm working with a human rights lawyer who's has an expert in airspace law and human rights. And we are, in this People's Tribunal, are proposing a new human right. And the hearings bring people together to consider the case for and against a human right to protect the freedom to live without physical or psychological threat from above.
And so you're actually organizing these tribunals. Yeah. It's not a concept, it's an actual. Yeah.
It's for me, it's an incredibly important development in my practice, in that after many years of working with people and working around this idea that there are different knowledges. Yep. And I'm very conscious that there is a hierarchy of knowledge that in my practice I want to challenge, both in terms of the kinds of work that I make, the way that I mobilize different voices in what are quite immersive installations, but also in the way that I bring people together. So the Airspace Tribunal, the first tribunal was held at Doughty Street Chambers, which is a major international law chambers where a lot of human rights barristers work from in London. And the next one was in Sydney, but I've also held these kind of meetings in the Middle East. I'm now working with people in Hiroshima, and I'm very excited to also work on holding a hearing in Toronto and also in Nunavut. And each hearing brings together these very different perspectives. So I've had climatologists, I've had people who have witnessed the use of chemical weapons, or the aftermath of the immediate aftermath of the use of chemical weapons, people who have expertise in the very kind of frontier of surveillance technologies.
You're going to be holding one of these in
Toronto.
In Toronto.
Yeah.
So I want to bring Jessica in here, because this is an area, Jessica, which you've done a lot of thinking about these, for those of us for whom art is painting or sculpture, these are practices that are far removed from that kind of. So I wondered about your thoughts on that, about, I guess specifically about the relationship really with the marketplace, because traditionally, obviously, how we fund art is by selling it, and that what's the.
Well, actually, it would be nice if we could fund art by selling it. But let's just say that, first of all, that not all artists or art now, or even in the fairly recent past, has been in any way oriented toward sales, and often against it. And when I think that in time, somehow, the art market, seems to be able, nevertheless, to do something about that, so that when you can come across a some kind of yellowed photographs of Vito Acconci walking down the street in New York with his notations underneath them and see a price tag in the tens of thousands of dollars. It's a little bit like the Holy Shroud. I mean, there's all kinds of work or objects or photographs or documents related to work, which then becomes saleable. So that's sort of the long arc. And then I think that nowadays, more and more, we see artists working with many mediums, whether it be drawing, photography, film, and both of these artists, I think, would cross into those areas as well. And at some point, should they desire it and should they be taken up into the market, then it's that kind of thing which may have a market eventually.
But that's not sort of the impetus in the immediate making of it. So, Shona, maybe you can, or sorry, Sasha, maybe you can come in here and tell us how you fund your practice. I mean, it's entirely on grants or.
It's a combination. I've been lucky to, since about 2008, to work full-time as an artist and funded through different foundations, but then there are commissions and so on. And Finland, where I'm based, is having really good support system, but not everybody gets those, so it's a lot of people applying these and so on. But I show my work mostly in institutions and some galleries as well, but I don't really have participated in the art fairs or in this.
So you're not participating in the market in that way, yeah. And Shona, what about you? Is it all? How are you funding the tribunals?
Well, I think there's a really interesting economy around big projects, and I think Sasha's probably the same for you. I imagine that you get kind of support from foundations, and I get support from foundations, I get commissions, I get a lot of publicly funded organizations have supported my work. But there's also a huge investment in the creative relationships that I have with many different people that support the work on many different levels that I think is really important to acknowledge. So there are, for instance, when you work with organizations that, and for me working with the power plant is incredibly important because it's an organization that really understands this kind of practice and understands the value and importance that I hold in art being a way of trying to initiate new conversations in the world and some form of change beyond the kind of art market, that space. And so there are also a lot of other enormous generosities. So when I went to St. Kilda, I chartered a yacht. The person who made that possible gave me a huge discount because he loved the project. He wasn't an artist, he wasn't a collector, he wasn't in the art world, he just understood the project, he loved the project. And through him, St. Kilda's impossible to get to, and you're not allowed to stay there. And I went 3 times. Each time I stayed for 2 weeks, I was given accommodation because people were interested in the project. They supported the
sort
project.
of social participation, really.
But it's also, I think, the power that art practice has to open up conversations with people that wouldn't otherwise happen. Mm-hmm. It's not an academic process. It's not it's not some authority coming in and telling people what they should be thinking. It's actually the dynamic of that exchange. And there have been individuals that have supported the work. There have been, Mm-hmm. So there's a kind of whole ecology, I think, that makes this kind of practice possible.
Sasha, do you find that too, that kind of...
Yeah,
I think you do,
yes. Because it's, within the art context, it's people don't think about the commercial side of it, because the work is quite research-based as well, and contributes to maybe a bit wider audience as well, or from different fields as well, which is really very interesting. So for me as well, collaboration is really important in that sense as well. It's not only about how the work is done, but so that's been, you know, it's not like a solo art practice alone in the studio kind of work, but it requires people from different fields and so on. That's
so very collaborative.
That makes the work also so interesting.
Another theme I felt I inevitably had to bring out was that of gender, since we're all women sitting here on the stage, and I didn't. Thank you. And I didn't want to be so simplistic as sort of say, well, you know, what's it like being a female artist, or how does your gender affect your work, since I think everybody's identity affects their work. But I did wonder if you had any feelings about it, how it affected your careers. And I know, Sasha, you told me before that you had an anecdote about that, that you did feel it was relevant.
Yeah, no, it's because my name is unisex name, Sasha is also a male name, and I just heard of different sides that people who don't know me, and some of the work, especially the works that I make with the staple gun, that you see some examples, they thought it's a male artist, but I'm a man, basically. I don't know, because they thought like
they see the staple gun as a
handle this kind of work. But I mean, I felt that was interesting to hear, because sometimes that was the first time where I heard my work looks like it was made by a man. Usually I'm used to get letters named Mr. Sasha Huber, because they just thought usually it's that name is belongs to a man. And then I made a work called Mr. Sasha Huber, and where I'm posing the question, okay, what makes an artwork masculine or feminine or something? You know, I never thought about it before that. And it's like a photographic series where I transform to become a man. So my hairs get cut, and suddenly I'm a man artist, and I look just like my grandfather, who's an artist, and he was from Haiti and co-founder of the art school Le Centre d'Art in Haiti. That's also where my art influence comes from my mother's side. So that was quite interesting. But other than that, I've been told the works that I've been doing, which are interventions, you know, with this renaming of a mountain, is a very masculine thing to do, to rename, to go and conquer mountains and places and name them after themselves. You know, this is a very. So I'm playing also with this power dynamic as well.
With that, and that association of that power with gender,
And the play comes just because I happen to be a woman. I think I would have made that work also if I would have been a man, probably. But you know, how do I know? I don't know. It's like not.
Yes, you can only know your own your own experience. Shona, do you feel it makes a difference to your practice or your career?
It's quite a tricky question. I mean, I think that it's incredibly important. I mean, I talked a little bit earlier about the impact of amnesia on our capacity to imagine the future. I think my position would be that I think it's incredibly important that culture and art practice is diverse, and that diverse voices, diverse experiences, diverse perspectives are represented. And that's not just for the benefit of those who are excluded to then become included. It's for everybody, because the narrower the field you have, the more detrimental that impact will be on how all of our futures might evolve, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. No.
And that for me is the point. That for me is the point. Absolutely, that is the point. Yeah.
Jessica, do you want to hop in here, and do you feel it makes a difference in curatorial practice too?
Well, I think that I've been in a profession that is populated by a lot of women, but that doesn't mean that they're necessarily in positions of power. But I'm glad that we're organizing the exhibitions, choosing the artists. It's interesting that I was at a conference some years ago where one of the topics was, and it was in Toronto, and it was, I think, as I recall, centered on Canadian art. What has changed the history of Canadian art recently? And there was all this, the panel, blah, blah, everybody's going on about possible exhibitions that changed the history, or circumstances, or grants, or things that, made things possible. And I'm sitting there, and I started writing down the names of women curators across the country, and then in the question period, I just put up my hand, and I started reciting them. And this slowly, and this went on and on and on, and it finally petered out. And, that was the point.
Yeah. So I wondered there about that power dynamic, right? And there are lots of arts institutions where you see that, where the foot soldiers are all women, but that ultimately institutions the directors still tend to be.
Well, I think, in Canada, just to put a positive note on things, we have an extraordinary situation with the National Gallery of Canada, where over a period of more than 50 years, there have been 4
Several women
curators, and only one, Mark Meyer, recently, for the last 10 years, but the only men in between in those periods were interim directors. So, that's good, although I think it's probably an exceptional situation. Directors have tended more and more to be appointed for their abilities to fundraise and to manage, and maybe that's a good thing as long as they keep their hands off the curatorial, which is unfortunately not often enough the case. I'm talking about large museums primarily, where it's not a director-curator situation. So, the power dynamics, I think, are what you can experience as a woman around the boardroom table, whether it's staff around the boardroom table, or whether it's the board around the boardroom table. And certainly, until very recently, in my experience, there were mainly men. And it was fairly clear who was doing the talking, and who was doing the interrupting, and who was doing the listening, and or not doing the listening. So I'd like to think that has slowly changed on boards that I've been on myself more recently.
That it is changing, yeah.
Well, if the director and the staff are, in the end, are beholden to a certain extent to a board, then you want to make sure the representation on the board has some understanding that goes beyond.
But I think that goes back to the fundraising issue too, doesn't it? The difficulty, of course, is that what we really need boards to do is raise funds, which may determine what kind of people go on them.
Yeah, there's a little bit of a paradox there at times, indeed.
Yeah. But that's maybe a paradox of art institutions in general. There's that sort of conflict between the art and the money. Another thing I wanted us to talk a bit about also was sort of globalism. I'm very struck here that we have 2 artists here who both come from sort of transnational backgrounds. And I often find when I'm writing about artists now, international artists, that you can't really put national labels. People are often living and working in different places than they came from, have all sorts of different stories about their cultural heritage. And I wondered whether either of you feel national labels count for anything anymore, whether you identify with the place you're in, or is there just this kind of global art class who are really cross-national borders, like whether nations still affect your work or your career anymore. Sasha, did you?
Yeah. Well, for me, I usually communicate my heritage. Swiss Haitian heritage is really important for me to say, because my Haitian heritage was like the starting point for my artist practice, really. So And then it's kind of clear. People don't need to ask anymore, So it's like, okay, that's there. And well, I also kind of continued my mother's path of traveling away from home, and so I'm living away from home as well in Finland. And then for me, it's very, since childhood, because we have family in different places, quite natural to be in different places. So I feel home always wherever I am myself as well. So for me, it's been very important for that reason, I think, also to work site-specifically and to make residencies. And those residencies are always really interesting because one gets connected to these people that one meets. And like Brazil, for instance, or New Zealand, or other places, and it kind of helps me also to understand the world we live in better when it's possible to meet people from different places, not just stay in one place. I really appreciate that possibility to have that chance to be in different places.
And Shona, do you identify with the UK, or you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I grew up in a very, very, very remote part of the UK, the Highlands of Scotland, on the very northwest corner. And that was a place that had incredible cultural oppression. So in my youth, it was within living memory that people had been physically punished, strapped at school for speaking Gaelic in the playground. So it was a complicated place to grow up. And I grew up there as an outsider. So my family moved there to a former, on the edge of a major military live bombing range, where NATO conduct their twice a year major live war exercises. 19 different states drop 1,000-pound bombs in that area. So I grew up in a very complicated cultural and social space, a space that was also in many ways seen as a kind of hinterland of Scotland. And on the borders, I have to say, there is a kind of prejudice against Highlanders and a slight embarrassment. So a complicated place, I couldn't. And then I moved to London. And for me, I love London because it is so diverse. And it is like you live in a place that belongs in some way to everyone who lives there, because there are multiple worlds that exist in that city. I would say one of the big issues in terms of internationalization would be, if we think about that as a global question, we have to think about privilege, access, we have to think about class, we have to think about, who can travel, who can't, who can get a visa to move. I was working with, as part of this project, an Iraqi santur player in UAE. And he is one of the few people, I mean, he's trained since he was 7 playing santur. He is an extraordinary player. I cannot get him a visa to come and work with me in the UK. So borders, national borders mean something in some contexts and not in another. So I think, and these are important conversations to have because they have an impact on what we see and who we engage with. And
Jessica, I often hear the complaint that Canadian artists aren't getting the attention they deserve on the international scene, or is not as active as they should be, or as well represented on the international scene. Do you think that's fair? Do you think Canadians aren't as good at being part of this kind of global?
Well, no, I don't think that's fair, and I don't quite see it that way. I mean, I think it's the kind of grumbling that, you find anywhere, not just here. But I see certainly a younger generation of artists who are going out and who are sometimes almost constantly on, residencies. And we have a number of artists now virtually around the world practicing in other cities and who are known. It's really getting them well known at home that's more problematic in some regards. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the things we lack here when I talk about residencies is that we have to open up, have people come in. It's the exchange.
It's a two-way
going
street.
To put our artists, on the map. And just as you said, is the artists I know who do these things, they meet other artists. It all starts with artists. No curator, no gallerist should ever claim that it starts with something they discovered or they found, nor should any collector for that matter. It starts with the artists. It starts with their relationships. So when they have those relationships in large international residencies, I'm not talking about inviting one artist for a few weeks. I'm talking about a building with 6 artists in it. I look out my window sometimes and I see the cranes and the development all over Toronto, and I'm thinking, what's going on? Isn't there some developer who wants to, even for a measured time, give a floor to artists and have something culturally really exciting happening where there's an exchange? Mm-hmm. I will say no more, but I think that these things are very important, and we could do better on that level.
That thought that it all starts with artists seems like a really good thought on which to wrap things up. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Power Plant for organizing this conversation, to Amelia and Gaetan for organizing, and to our wonderful panelists. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you.